Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the November edition of the FTA Brexit webinar. I have to admit this is a bit of a special one because we've had to go through more than 500 pages of text overnight. With quite late evening, as you will understand, I'm sure, still quite a few questions, but we'll try and debrief you as best as we can on the agreement. Which, as I will stress later, remains very fragile politically. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we are going to take you through the current status of negotiations, bearing in mind this might change during the webinar, you never know. We're going to then talk you through the bits of the draft withdrawal agreement that particularly relate to logistics. Before focusing on no deal preparedness, communication on contingency measures that the European Commission has announced they would be ready to take in the event of no deal. And then my colleague Sarah is going to take you through some of the additional guidance released by DFT recently on road haulage permits in the event of no deal. And after that, we will conclude with some next steps, dates to put in your diary, and some advice, because I do recognize that this must be a very daunting prospect, and I don't suppose that all of you have read the more than 500 pages of the agreement, and you're probably wondering what that means for you and what to do, considering the ongoing uncertainties. Before we start with the webinar proper, just on house rules as usual, please keep your microphone and telephone muted. The webinar will be recorded. The recording is going to be made available on the FTA website and FTA YouTube channel as well. And unfortunately, as usual, we will not be able to deal with technical issues during the webinar. But if you do have a question, of course, you can use the chat box, and you will always be able to go back to the record of the webinar. Obviously, members are more than welcome to contact us directly as well if they have any questions. So in terms of the state of play of negotiations, so that you understand where we are, it's been an interesting 48 hours, to say the least. There has been a political agreement reached between the European Union and the UK on the text of the withdrawal agreement. This is the divorce settlement. It's the binding treaty that would be setting out the provisions for the transition for EU citizens and in the UK and UK citizens in the EU, the financial settlement, as well as quite a few aspects related to the movement of goods in transit, VAT and that kind of things for movements that are happening around Brexit time, and of course the infamous Irish protocol or Irish backstop. So indeed an agreement was reached at negotiators level. This was then validated last evening, quite late, by the cabinet. The Prime Minister announced it yesterday. Since then, unfortunately, we've seen a few resignations, including from the Brexit Secretary. So things are not extremely stable at this point in time politically at UK level. I would just say that. There was also a draft declaration on the future relationship, which is a sort of summary or outline of what the UK and the EU think the future relationship could look like. That future relationship would only be negotiated after Brexit, so during the transition period, assuming the withdrawal agreement could be ratified. So there aren't that many details at this stage, and it remains relatively aspirational, I suppose, and of course it wouldn't be binding, but I will tell you more about this nonetheless in a few seconds. So in terms of this outline for the future relationship, yes, it's vague, it's not binding, but it does provide some good news for aviation and road haulage that would seem to get something fairly comparable to what we have so far in terms of market access. The section on aviation is much more detailed than the one on road haulage, and details are missing for that one, unfortunately. So it's not impossible that permits could be required, although obviously the big difference between no deal and permits as part of a future relationship is that their number would be much, much higher in order to provide for the transport needs. We do hope that will not be the case, though, and that permits will not be required, but I'm afraid we'll have to wait for that one. I think cabotage is likely to be limited in any case, but it doesn't really go into the details on that one. Rail would likely get bilateral arrangements with individual member states instead. Perhaps not the best outcome, but still better than the no deal, definitely. And I think there will be plenty of time during the transition, assuming the withdrawal agreement is ratified, to try and put some meat on the bones of this text. In terms of trade, what this communication, non-binding, says at this stage is that the new relationship would be based on the customs provisions set out in the Irish backstop, this combined customs territory, and in a few minutes I'll tell you what we understand about this at this point in time. There could be possible reductions in the rate of physical checks for regulatory aspects, such as, for instance, sanitary checks on agri-food products. But it remains, unfortunately, still fairly vague. To be entirely honest, it does not sound completely frictionless to us at this point in time, but we need to allow for the fact that this is still a rather vague, non-binding document and that proper trade negotiations would only start post-Brexit. Now, the really important part to focus on is the withdrawal agreement, the divorce settlement. This is the only legally binding document that would be agreed before Brexit. I have to admit, I've not had the chance to read all of this, as it's more than 500 pages of very dense legal text, but I went through most of the relevant parts for you, and I cross-referenced it with summaries kindly provided by the European Commission, as well as other documents I could find to check that my interpretation was the correct one. In terms of the transition period, first of all, so it would provide for a status quo period of time, at least until the end of December 2020. That you knew already, it's not new, including hopefully for international agreements, where the EU is going to notify international partners that during a transition period, the UK would be assimilated to a member state for the purpose of international agreements, including agreements that would provisionally apply or enter into force during the transition period. So that would cover things like trade agreements with Canada, Korea, or Japan that the EU has in place, or customs agreements on EU mutual recognition with the US or China, as well as land transport agreement with Switzerland or the aviation agreement with the US. So it's relatively good news, confirmed. The big difference, of course, with what we've seen previously is that there is now a provision to extend, only once, unfortunately, but to extend this transition period. That needs to happen at the UK's request. So the UK needs to ask for it. But if there is no prospect of an agreement, a trade agreement, that would remove the need for an Irish backstop by, say, July 2020, then there will be automatically a review mechanisms, and if the UK asks for it, the transition could be extended. There is no time limit set out for the extension of the transition period. It's 20XX at this point. It's unclear whether or not a time limit will be defined later on, or whether it will remain relatively vague to provide more flexibility to both sides in 2020, depending on progress with the trade negotiations. Obviously, though, any extension would be attached to increased payments from the UK into the EU budget, but it would also mean that UK economic operators would still benefit from EU programs and support. everyone in the UK would remain bound by EU rules during that extension, should it happen. But that also means that there would be unfettered access to the single market and no additional red tape to what we have today. So it's worthwhile noting that that would also apply to rules that would be decided during the transition period. So those of you who have been following the ongoing revision of driver's hours rules, cabotage, operator licensing, or aspects related to minimum wage and the posting of workers will be, I'm sure, interested in knowing that all of this, should it be agreed at EU level, would probably apply in the UK as well, as we had previously stated. So that's for the transition. Now, in terms of the actual backstop or Irish protocol, what is fair to say is that, as previously stated, the common travel area would continue to be protected. So there would continue to be a freedom of movement element between Ireland and the UK. The Irish backstop would apply unless and until it gets superseded in whole or in part by a subsequent agreement. In other words, there is no time limit set in the text. And the backstop would, in our view, definitely apply unless appropriate new arrangements removing the need for a hard border on the island of Ireland took over. So should a free trade agreement be agreed post-2020, that agreement could, in theory, replace part or the whole of the Irish protocol, assuming, of course, that it did remove the need for a hard border. So you might ask, how would this be decided? Well, what the text says is that the UK or the EU could both send a letter to a joint committee made of EU and UK representatives. And that letter would say that they do not feel that the backstop agreement is necessary anymore because there is a replacement solution. They would have to provide their reasons. And then within 6 months of this notification, the joint committee would decide whether the conditions are met for the backstop to cease to apply, partly or in full. The draft also says that both sides would try to reach a free trade agreement, as I said, by July 2020, but should this fail, would have the option to extend the transition. By the look of it, I think it's fair to say the UK would not be in the customs union, but in a combined customs territory, made of the UK customs territory and the EU territory. There is an annex called Annex 2 to the protocol, which explains what this would mean. And what we understood is that customs duties on imports and exports and any charges having an equivalent effect would be prohibited between the parts of the single customs territory. So that's valid for goods produced in the UK and the EU, as well as goods from the rest of the world that have essentially already cleared customs in one or the other territory. And it's something that would apply for the whole of the UK. So no customs duties and no charges. There would be no need for checks on rules of origin. These rules are there to basically demonstrate the product has been produced at a sufficiently high percentage in a given country so that it can benefit from preferential access granted to products coming from that country. So the benefit of this combined customs territory is that this is not something companies apparently would need to worry about. It would, however, still be possible for both territories to restrict the import or export of goods from the other party, for instance, on public health or plant health grounds. By the look of it, the UK will need to apply the EU's external tariffs on goods from the rest of the world. I suppose in a sense, this is good as it brings clarity. It means that the external tariffs would remain what they are today. And it says, however, that there could be no lower UK tariffs negotiated through free trade agreements with, say, the US or China. The UK would need to keep applying EU rules of origin on products from the rest of the EU quotas and other restrictions would apply to the UK, and the UK could not decide to unilaterally remove such quotas or indeed duties for such countries like the US without approval of the joint EU-UK committee. So at least in theory, some restrictions, I suppose, in what could be done in terms of trade agreements with countries like the US or China. The GSP, the reduction or no tariffs on products from developing countries, all these arrangements would keep applying to the UK, which will be very good news indeed for our retailers members, especially who import products from developing countries. It would mean no additional duties compared to what you would pay at the moment. And any defense trade measures adopted by the EU would also apply to the UK on products coming from such countries. It is worth noting that fisheries would be excluded from this arrangement by the look of it. So we'll have to study that in more details, but it's probably good for you to know that already now. The Union's Customs Code, the UCC, which is the customs rules at European level, setting the provisions for releasing products into free circulation within the EU, would only continue to apply to Northern Ireland, not the whole of the UK. So we need to study in more details what that means in practice. By the look of it, we do not think that customs declarations would be needed between the UK and the EU, but this is really to be confirmed. The annexes do talk about the need for something called a movement certificate. And it seems to us that this could be a new simplified procedure for customs between the UK and the EU. But we will really be looking to confirm that this with government, as this particular part of the text is indeed relatively complex to understand. As far as single market goes, only Northern Ireland would be in significant parts of the single market by the look of it. Northern Ireland would remain aligned to a limited set of rules that are related to the EU single market and that are really needed to avoid a hard border, such as legislation on goods, on sanitary rules for veterinary controls, on agricultural production marketing, VAT, and excise, as well as state aid rules. By the look of it, Great Britain would not be covered by many rules related to product standards and authorizations of food safety and hygiene. And as a consequence, we think that Great Britain would be treated as a third country with checks on products from Great Britain upon entry into Northern Ireland, for instance, for sanitary purposes on agri-food, unless that is, of course, an agreement were to be negotiated by the UK and the EU as a whole, removing the need for these checks. There is a commitment to avoid checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain and vice versa as much as possible, but no membership of the single market for the UK as a whole, as far as we can tell, and nothing binding that would really remove the need for, say, sanitary checks on agri-food products. So something that would have to be negotiated through the future relationship. A future free trade agreement could help reduce the need for physical checks, we think, on agri-food products. But the big question mark would be documentary and identity checks. To be honest, this is already required for live animals, as Ireland and Great Britain are in two different epidemiological units. But in the future, these checks could also apply to things like dairy products, meat, fish, and more, including some ready-made meals. So worth considering, and of course, getting a provision in the future free trade agreement that would considerably reduce the pain around these checks would be most welcome, and that would also apply in relation to Northern Ireland, Great Britain. There are lots of provisions to make sure that the agreement will not prevent the UK from removing the need for checks on products that would come from Northern Ireland and go to Great Britain. Again, something worth studying because it's unclear at this stage what legal value these things would have, but it would give a bit of flexibility to the UK. The UK as a whole would nonetheless have to sign up to certain rules related to environmental protection, for instance, against climate change, to limit CO2 emissions, So I think it's fair to assume that things related to CO2 standards for vans and trucks, for instance, would keep applying. The UK will also need to sign up to a non-derogation clause on social standards, and common standards would apply. It's not entirely clear to us what that would mean in practice, but we are working on the assumption that it could mean that things like working time would probably still apply. There are also provisions related to state aid and to competition law, such as abuse of dominant position. All these measures are there really to protect the EU against what they see as potential social or environmental dumping from the UK, or against protectionist measures that they fear could be taken by the UK in the future, such as massive state aid to support UK companies and give them what the EU would feel would be an unfair advantage. The text talks about protecting elements of joint cooperation related to transport on the island of Ireland, but it's extremely vague and it does not provide more details as to what that would mean for Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland movements by road. I would assume it would mean continued access to each other's transport networks, and I stress I'm only talking about operators based in Northern Ireland here. But I would really like to have an official confirmation, and until we have that, we have to assume it doesn't, and that would be something to take care of in the future relationship. So, in a nutshell, this is where we are with the content of the withdrawal agreement. In terms of the next steps, so by the end of this week, the member states in the other 27 countries will have time to analyze the text. It's fair to say that although they were briefed regularly on progress, yesterday would have been the first time many of these national officials in other countries would have actually seen the text. So the UK might not be the only one to potentially have certain comments or requests for minor changes. It is, however, important to stress that the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has encouraged them not to push their luck too much, because this was already a very, very difficult compromise to find and very fragile indeed. Then on Monday, there will be a meeting of European Affairs Ministers from the 27 remaining member states. And then the European Commission on the next day would be requested to agree the future relationship declaration with the UK. So it remains to be seen whether that non-binding text I was talking about earlier, which only gives some vague indications about the future, is going to change a little bit between now and Tuesday. We'll obviously keep you updated on that one. Then on Sunday, the 25th of November, unless there are major political developments, for instance, in the UK, meaning that the agreement does not stand anymore, there would be a European Council to formalize the agreement. And we could then see, if all goes well, a vote in the UK Parliament as early as December, and assuming it goes well, at the beginning of next year, probably a vote in the European Parliament. But at this point, I want to say this looks good in the sense that it would certainly give us more time to prepare, a bit of breathing space. It removes the cliff edge in March 2019, but it's not a done deal. Although the Cabinet has agreed, there have been numerous resignations afterwards. The arithmetic in the UK Parliament are not particularly reassuring. We've heard from the leader of the Conservative Party a few minutes before the start of the webinar that he would not support this agreement and that he encouraged his MPs not to support it. There are probably quite a few people in the Conservative Party that wouldn't either, and they've already said so, and the EP are unlikely to support it either. So trying to find a majority is going to be extremely tricky. Unless this majority can be found, the government survives until, or the Prime Minister at least survives until then, and the deal survives until then, we are back to square one. We're back to the threat of no deal. And I would say, considering how fragile politically all of this is and what's at stake, please bear in mind that the threat of no deal is still very much real, in spite of good progress. And that leads me to what the European Commission has said, which unfortunately was largely ignored because it came out just a few hours before the deal was reached. But they published a document which explains their strategy and their contingency plans and measures in the event of no deal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was very, very disappointing indeed. Measures would only last until the end of 2019. They could be revoked unilaterally by the EU at any time. There was no plan for road haulage market access beyond saying that there won't be enough permits, but essentially the Commission is not going to do anything about it. So that would leave it up to member states to try and very, very quickly negotiate maybe bilateral agreements or find other solutions with the UK. But at the same time, the document also warns member states against starting discussions and talks with the UK at this stage. So this is really, really not reassuring for road haulage, market access, and the other issues attached to it. It's better for aviation, certainly. There are some basic provisions for things like technical stops or for continued operation between the UK and the EU, so for flights going from the UK to the EU and vice versa. And some good provisions around continued validity of aviation safety certificates for a few months until something more permanent was negotiated. But it's really, really not good enough because that's only until the end of 2019 and could be revoked unilaterally. Obviously, the EU would insist on reciprocity as well. There was nothing really significant on customs in there. No real plan to mitigate no deal for customs. Only some references to the Common Transit Convention, but basically implying that the accession process is not a done deal. On that basis, I also learned yesterday from French customs that there will be a sort of revision to see whether or not that application can go through on the 15th of December. No waiver for things like safety and security declarations. So if you've attended our AirTalk conferences, you will know that these would be obligations for legally for the haulier in the event of accompanied transport, or the ferry company in the event of unaccompanied transport. It's a big headache, but they're not planning to have a waiver at this stage. I then quizzed the number 2 of French Customs yesterday about this, and the response was that tactically now is not the time to publicize very good contingency measures that you would take in the event of no deals. So I'm so hopeful that something better could be on the table eventually, but unfortunately what we could see there was not very reassuring. The same for sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Actually, it even says the UK would probably not be listed as an authorized country straight away. The timing is unclear, but that would mean that there could be no exports from agri-food products coming from the UK to the European Union, Ireland included, potentially for a little while. We need to get a confirmation from DEFRA about this, but they had raised that possibility with us, so that's indeed quite concerning. I suppose the positive is that there would be no visa required for short stays into the EU. It's unclear at this point whether that's only for tourism reasons or also for business trips. I would assume that drivers who come and do deliveries would fall in that category, but to be confirmed. So this is, a reminder of what no deal would mean, not very good, and the Commission is not ready at this stage to make significant concessions in terms of contingency measures. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah to take you through some of the latest guidance from DfT about road haulage permits that would apply in the event of no deal, which, as I said, is still unfortunately a serious prospect considering the ongoing volatile situation at political level.
So I'll start with a reminder of what we already knew about the EUCMT permits, and I'll then summarize what's new in the latest guidance from the Department for Transport. So if there is no transition period, obviously government would seek emergency bilateral road haulage agreements, but there is absolutely no guarantee that these could be concluded in time, and no guarantee that all countries you operate in would be covered. So the only system that will be there, no matter what, is EUCMT permits. You may remember that the number of permits is extremely limited. For next year, there will be only 984 permits for all UK hauliers. So these permits will be oversubscribed. The latest guidance issued by government confirms that there will be a 4-week time window for applications from the 26th of November until the 21st of December. So please bear in mind these days, because this is the only opportunity for you as a road haulage company to apply for EUCMT permits for next year. If you're a shipper or a logistics provider, please make sure that the carriers you work with are aware of the permit requirements and aware of this time window so that they don't miss the deadline. So in what situation do you need an EUCMT permit? Well, in a no-deal scenario, they will be required for lorries in all EU countries. However, vehicles under 3.5 tons, vans, will be allowed on EU roads without a permit in most countries, but there is an exception in Italy, because Italy doesn't recognize the exemption for vans. So you would need a permit to operate a light vehicle there. If you operate heavy goods vehicles on own account, we advise you to apply for permits as well. There is an exemption for own account in certain countries, but almost a dozen EU countries do not recognize this exemption and still require a permit for an account, and France is one of them, which is why we really recommend you to still apply for permits for your own account operations. I'd like to mention that there is a special status for international removals. So if your company carries out these type of transport operations, specifically for international removals, you don't need an EUCMT permit, but you do need an EUCMT authorization. And the main difference is that these authorizations are not subject to any quotas, unlike the permits. So you will have to apply for a different document, and these authorizations are issued in the UK by DVSA. So based on this, if you think you need permits for next year, in case of no deal, you can start preparing your application now. And the first thing to do is to calculate how many permits you want to apply for. So to calculate that, you have to bear in mind that a permit can be used in several vehicles successively, but not simultaneously. To put it in a nutshell, if you want to be able to have 5 vehicles in the EU at the same time, you would need 5 permits. We strongly recommend you do not apply for more permits than needed just to be on the safe side, because that would lower the intensity of use of each permit, which is one of the allocation criteria. And in turn, this would lower your application score and lower your ability to get a permit. I encourage you to read the full guidance document. You have a link on the slide to access this document. Have a look at the other criteria for allocation in order to substantiate your application and to underpin it. You will have to submit some data, starting with the number of international trips you did over the last 12 months to reflect what you expect to be able to do next year with your EUCMT permit. And you will also be asked to provide a percentage of your trips which were international over the last 12 months. So the idea is to take into account how reliant each haulage company is on the international part of their business. In addition to that, the Euro class of vehicles will also be taken into account because the permits for next year, the annual permits for 2019, are restricted to Euro 6 vehicles only. So you will have to have documents to prove that, and in particular, you will have to provide a certificate of conformity, which you can have from the VSA or from your vehicle manufacturer. Government will also take into account the sector of the economy you primarily serve as a haulage company. The idea is not to prioritize one sector over the other. It's rather to ensure that permits are spread across the various sectors. So each application will be considered only and will be compared only to other applications within the same sector of the economy. There's an option to indicate that you just provide general haulage services with no particular sector. So again, that will ensure that permits are spread, but doesn't mean that your application will be prioritized or deprioritized. So that's what I wanted to highlight at this stage, but please read the full guidance document that the FTA published, and if you have any questions, please get in touch with us.
Thank you, Sarah. So that leaves us with one big question for you: what to do? What can you do? Our strong advice to you, considering the fragile political situation, is to keep planning for no deal, because the agreement remains very, very fragile indeed, and will do so for, I believe, potentially a few weeks, if it survives until then. Don't take it for granted. Don't listen to some of the headlines you might have read in the news that this is it, a deal has been reached and everything will be fine. In any case, Brexit is unlikely to mean that the status quo will continue forever. So there are certain elements of your plans that will be useful regardless of the outcome, that will make you more competitive in any case, no matter what happens. So for instance, if you are working on improving the robustness of your data, related obviously to customs requirements or other authorities' requirements, but you want to do that more generally and have a bit more robust data about your EU movements in much the same way you would for rest of the world trade, maybe this is an opportunity to do so. Maybe this is an opportunity to rethink the way you organize your supply chains and see if you can optimize anything. This is certainly an opportunity as well to try and automatize a lot of your processes. So for instance, in relation to customs, maybe you want to think about solutions that could help you automatize as much as possible for the data entry, that kind of things. So there are indeed quite a lot of things that obviously will be costly, painful, and I do appreciate you would prefer to avoid it, but if you do decide to take up these preparatory measures anyway, they will probably not be wasted. The permits, as we said, frankly, if you don't apply and then there's no deal, you might be left not being able to operate at all. So it's a matter of making sure you can still have a business if you really rely heavily on international haulage after Brexit. And there are other things as well that we will have recommended that you do that we would strongly recommend you look at very, very seriously if you're not done so already. Obviously, things like recruitment, I understand you might be reluctant to recruit massively if there is a question mark as to whether this will be needed right now. But if you can postpone decisions for a few weeks without losing the options on some candidates you might have, for instance, this is something we would advise that you do, because the situation might change very quickly. And if you decide to freeze a recruitment process and then let go of people you had in mind, you might not be able to have access to them anymore afterwards. So be quite careful with this. Obviously, this is going to change very regularly. For more general planning guidance, FTA members will have received an electronic copy of a note on how to prepare for Brexit that we sent. I would suggest that a lot of it is still very, very much valid, and there will also be an annex to the supplement to the Freight and Logistics magazine in principle next month, and that will build upon this. Things will change very quickly, so please stay tuned. If you do not already receive the FTA Brexit Digest, and you haven't yet sent me an email, and I'll process the ones I've received last week as soon as possible. But if you've not done so already, please do send me an email and we'll set you up on the system. That will make sure that every Monday in your inbox you will get an analysis of the situation for the logistics sector, as well as recommendations as to what this would mean for your business. Before I leave you, just the forthcoming dates, FTA events and activities. Reminder about the Brexit Digest. You have my email address there. On the 21st of November, which is next week, we have our next FTA Customs group meeting in London. I'm sure that many of you will have questions about the customs, the UK-wide customs provisions in the withdrawal agreement, so that would be a nice opportunity to learn more about it. The plan is also to devote a big part of the meeting to CDS, the customs declaration system. So I'm sure you might have questions about this, so if you do, now is the time to contact Alex and see if you can attend. On the 19th of December, we're also planning to organize a Getting Logistics Ready for Brexit conference in central London, and you will find a link on the slide to the program and registration page, which is available on our website. We have decided to do this quite late, I appreciate, but that will make sure that we have the latest information. Hopefully, any vote that could happen in the House of Commons would have happened by then. Hopefully, things would have stabilized, so we would be in a better position to really tell you more definitely what to do to prepare adequately. But please don't wait for that to start preparing as well. The next webinar, there will not be one in December because we have this event on the day before the day we had originally penciled for one. So the next webinar will be on the 17th of January. So that makes it all the more useful for you to register for the digest if you want to get updated in the meantime more regularly. And after that, you have the two other dates of the ones we've planned for next year. So the message to you is stay tuned, be very, very careful, and keep planning until we have confirmation. I see that there is a question. I think we can maybe...
Yes, there is a question from Darren asking to confirm that ECMT permits will only be available to Euro 6 vehicles. So the answer is yes. For next year, ECMT annual permits will be restricted to Euro 6 vehicles. So that's what you can apply for during the 4-week time window I've explained. However, there will be a very small number of ECMT monthly permits that will be reserved for Euro 5 vehicles or other vehicles, older vehicles. We don't have full clarity yet about how these will be allocated, but what's for sure is that they won't be part of the application wave that will start on the 26th this month. So as soon as we hear more information about the monthly Euro 5 permits, we'll share that with members. And if you have any other questions, please do get in touch.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't see at this stage other questions in the chat box. No, this is the only one we've received so far. If you are still typing, sometimes they come through a bit later, in which case we would probably respond to you separately if this is all right. Obviously, please feel free to get in touch if you have more questions. And as I said, there will be more opportunities to provide you with further details, not least in our Brexit Digest. A colleague of ours is going to attend a debrief with DEXI this afternoon, which will provide an opportunity for further questions and clarifications, hopefully. So stay tuned, stay with us, and keep preparing in the meantime. Thank you very much. Goodbye.